So Tommaso, Andreas, and then we should have Gina online. Please sit down, we start immediately. So let me just kind of introduce this panel. This group doesn't need introduction, of course. I want to continue on the theme I opened up with. Hey! I want to continue with the theme I opened with, which is this notion that in some way we need to reorient, or it is a time to reorient antitrust for the new political economy. I love that people are having chats on the side, but hey, will you please just be a little disciplined. So, price versus power. I love this expression because, of course, we've been pursuing price, lower price, greater output as one of the fundamental tenets of antitrust enforcement. And the real substance of much of the shift in the pendulum has been, is it really price we worry about? Isn't there a bigger problem with power and the way power is exercised in our society? And isn't antitrust central to this? So one of the things I face a lot is this notion that when I discuss these things, people say to me, but you want antitrust to become political. We are doing something which is pure at the moment. It's technocratic. We have the laws. We are technocrats. We don't want anything to do. We've made antitrust pure, and that's how it should stay. So I want to challenge that notion because I think it is not so. What we're doing is not apolitical and pure, but I want Luigi Zingales, of course, a noted speaker on this topic, and many others, to just help understand this fundamental point. We are not in a world in which what we've been doing for the last 20, 30 years is neutral. It is deeply political, but let Luigi develop that.
First of all, thank you very much, Christina, for inviting me in this fantastic kermesse. And I would like to start with actually a quote, and I challenge anybody to come up with who said this statement. The task of our day is to promote freedom by promoting the dispersion of power necessary for a competitive order. This is nobody short of Iron Director in 1947 and the first meeting of the Mundt Pellin Society. So, long way from the Iron Director most of us know later on. Clearly, this is very much under the influence of his mentor and teacher, Henry Simons, who had died a year before. But this Iron Director was not alone at the time in the United States. 2 years later, Emanuel Seller, who is the father of the last important antitrust act in the United States, declared, we have seen what happened in the other industrial countries of the Western world. They allowed the free growth of monopolies and cartels until this private concentration grew so strong that either big business would own the government or the government will have to seize control of big business. And not to be left behind, the co-author of his piece of legislation, Kefauver, said, I'm opposed to both Nazis and socialists. That's why I'm also opposed to private monopolies and near-monopolies, which help to spur on both of these movements. So how did the American antitrust primary concerns went from being freedom to become consumer welfare? In her book, Thinking Like an Economist, Elizabeth Popp Berman claims that this is part of a broader movement where economists are taking over policy and they're replacing policy objectives with technocratic ones. Now, first of all, I think that the bad news is economists are not alone. If you look at what happened during the pandemic, epidemiologists substituted epidemiological objective to political objective. And why, in part, I think, is the weakness of the political system. When the choice is a bad one, it's a choice between educating your young and killing your old, nobody wants to take the responsibility of doing that trade-off. And so you try to hide behind an expert that say there is no alternative. That's the only solution. Every time you hear there is no alternative, watch, because generally there is an alternative and they don't want you to consider that alternative. But I am sort of subscribed to Clemenceau's view of the world, and Clemenceau is famous for many things. One of that is to say the war is too serious a matter to let the generals run it. If it's true for war, must be true a fortiori for antitrust policy. Now, unlike Bob Berman, I do not believe that we should eliminate economic thinking, as we should not eliminate or ignore military strategy when it comes to war, but we should subordinate economic thinking or military strategy to political objective. That's what I stated in a short American Economic Review paper and proceeding 4 years ago, and what I think is important, and we should all read as economists. But even more important, I think Bob Berman seems to ignore the most important force behind the transformation that we have observed in policy in general, the industry demand for ideas that benefit industry. And in particular, the industry demand for ideas that minimize tax enforcement, antitrust enforcement. So suppose that today I were to invent a new theory why it's good not to enforce corporate tax payment. I think that immediately I will have a lot of attention from all the corporations who are only eager not to pay taxes. And my students will become the preferred employee of a lot of law firms and tax advisory firms, and probably industry will push them in all the ranks of the administration in order to infer the preferred policy. And, you know, in fact, we're not that far away from this today, because the modern practice of transfer prices for intellectual properties is a way to de facto not enforce corporate taxes for some people, and that has become very popular in the industry. So what I have claimed with Eric Posner and Filippo Lancieri is the rise and dominance of the consumer welfare standard in antitrust follow a similar pattern. It was a combination of bad economics and good marketing fueled by powerful interest. I say bad economics because consumer welfare is a term that doesn't exist in economics. We have consumer surplus or total welfare. Why the combination of the two? Because from a marketing point of view, that was fantastic. The term appealed to the progressive with the emphasis on consumers, and appealed to the conservatives with its emphasis on total welfare or efficiency. Most importantly, the concept made it easy for companies to merge after paying the proper amount of tribute to economists in the form of consulting fees. It seems like a win-win solution. The economists get money and prestige, and the industry get to concentrate freely. No surprises that this idea had instant success, and no surprise it has monopolized academia for 40 years. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not questioning here the motives of the founders of the Chicago School. I think that they generally believe that monopolies did not last if not endorsed by the state. I think we were wrong, but they were legitimately wrong. And the pendulum of enforcement at the time had gone too far, prohibiting even mergers that today, under any point of view, probably we consider benign. However, 40 years later, the pendulum has swung too much in the opposite direction. The consumer welfare standard failed to block a rising concentration, which has been detrimental to consumers, and I think most importantly, is threatening our freedom. Now, as Chris Dixon, who's a venture capitalist, not a communist, laments in his recent book, today the top 1% of social networks account for 95% of social web traffic and 86% of social mobile app use. The top 1% of search engine accounts for 97% of search traffic, and the top 1% of e-commerce account for 57% of traffic, of e-commerce traffic. Outside of China, Apple and Google account for more than 95% of the mobile app store market. And as I was discussing yesterday with Tommaso, and as we will discuss at the Zingales Antitrust Conference, AI does not have a much brighter future, because we start with very concentrated industry to begin with, and the suppliers of the industry are equally concentrated. If that was not enough, the standard failed by its own narrow criteria, because we see that mergers do lead to price increases, And most of the analysis suggests that the efficiency increases are very small or zero. So what can we do? First, we need to recognize that underlying any antitrust policy, there are important political choices. All too often, as Christina said, consumer welfare standard is defended as apolitical, but consumer welfare is a political goal with all the facts of political goals, its ambiguity, and none of the benefits, which is a political legitimacy. I think that among the political goals of antitrust, the first should be to preserve our freedom. Our freedom to choose among different products, our freedom to change jobs without fear of retaliation, and our freedom to speak without fear of consequences. I want a world where you can as easily get a job if you are pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, where you can as easily find a source of news whether you believe that Tibet is part of China, as I don't, or is not. A world where you can survive in the marketplace, where you espouse the dominant ideology or not. I think we should bring this goal into our antitrust theory and into our antitrust practice. I think that the new merger guidelines in the United States are a small step in this direction. I think smaller than I wish, probably bigger than most people expected. To reach with this goal, we need to develop more than just antitrust policy. We need to develop a competition policy. In the 20th century, to prosper, competitive capitalists needed a legal infrastructure, a point Raghu Rajan and I made in a book over 20 years ago. In the 21st century, to prosper, competitive capitalism needs not only a legal infrastructure, needs also a technological infrastructure that support interoperability and competition. In this respect, I think that there is a real opportunity in an alliance between Europe and India. India has developed a stack system that from payment to data storage, from e-commerce to AI development, promotes competition and resiliency. Europe needs to ally with India and form the largest and most powerful market in the world. After all, our own director was right. The task of our day is to promote freedom by promoting the dispersion of power necessary for a competitive order. For 50 years, we have forgotten it. Time has come to bring this goal back.
Very good, thank you. And Luigi did exactly what I wanted him to do, which is bring out the absolute truism that what we do today is not neutral. This is what I keep hearing all the time. It's technocratic, it's pure. It has historical, political roots. Now let me move on to Tommaso, who again needs no introduction. He comes from within the tent in this town because, of course, he was chief economist at the Commission. And I alluded to, Tommaso, this big push in the period between 2000 and 2010 towards the more economic approach. We were all kind of thinking at the time this was going to be a way to enlightenment. And then my sense is that things have somehow gone wrong in that while I'm not making a general statement against economics in antitrust, there is a sense that things have narrowed down into a pretty closed bubble, churchy statements about pro-competitive and efficient. How do you see it?
Thank you, Christina. It's great to be here. Good morning, everybody. So it's a pleasure to continue after the big picture of Luigi. Luigi gave a very fascinating historical perspective. What happened in Europe 3 decades ago is that basically we imported from the US the more economic approach to antitrust. We set up our own economic consultancies. You contributed to that, Christina. You were at the very forefront from day one. I wasn't. And it must have been very exciting. I'm sure you wanted to bring, good economic principle to antitrust that didn't exist before. You wanted to do it in a thorough way. Must have been, like a startup feeling because you were starting something new. And then economics by the professional economists, because academics were largely absent. The professional economists became very successful by several metrics, and I think they have become a victim of their own success. So the market of consultancies, in line with other industries, became fairly concentrated. The top 3 Consulting companies in Europe command more than 50% of the market. There are very high margins. The market is worth only in Europe, only for antitrust, about €1 billion per year. This is good money. And like in other industries, there has been very little innovation. So the debate has been over a few very narrow set of instruments. And the business model, if you want to be honest, is basically trying to make money by protecting much bigger rents that large corporations have. This is what the business is about to a large extent. Of course, I also like to be very, I don't want to give a nuanced message, otherwise the message gets lost. Of course, there are exceptions, but I'm not interested in the exceptions. So I'm going to make two claims, and the two claims which I'm making is that the practice of economics has become very narrow on a few models that appear to be scientific, but they don't really work in practice. That's a big claim. And the other claim is that the profession has been very insular and not interested in other developments that were happening, including from other branches of economics. These are my two claims which I want to articulate. The first one, the industry de facto concentrates on a narrow set. I will give you an example. As every example, it has limitation, but it is a relevant example. Take mergers. Mergers is a big thing. We heard mergers have been part of the causes for the increases in concentration that we have witnessed over the past 20, 30 years, because we approved mostly all of them, with a few exceptions, and then we talk about exceptions only. But by and large, we approve all of them. So when we apply our tools from economics to mergers, we're very precise. We can identify overlaps if they exist. And when they exist, we are very surgical in identifying the kind of divestiture which are needed. So we say we are surgical. We just get away the bad stuff without removing the good stuff. It happens that the good stuff is almost everywhere and the bad stuff is very narrow, but we take it out. So these are methods that we've been employing for many, many years. And if you take at face value what the methods are saying, the methods are used by the enforcers. The methods are a decision tool, and if we approve mergers as we do, is because they will not harm consumers. Otherwise, we would not have approved them, right? The methods is telling me that there won't be any harm to consumers. That's why they're approved. If anything, consumers will gain from these amazing efficiencies which are always put forward. So if we believe in the way the methods work, you would expect that no merger ex post would increase prices. Either prices stay constant if those efficiencies don't exist, or prices go down if those efficiencies go down. Okay? If the method is very good, you would have all prices being either there, constant, or going down. Now, I was reading an academic study, a meta-study, nothing to do with Facebook. A meta-study is just a statistical collection of all existing studies on a certain topic. So a meta-study of retrospective analysis of approved mergers by different agencies. No one wants to single out anyone. So a meta-study of all mergers, and the researcher does the right thing. She analyzes only mergers that were vetted. So she's not mixing apples and oranges. She's only looking at vetted mergers, which are precisely those we would have expected either prices to be constant or to go down. The answer is, in 55% of the cases, prices go up. I understand there may be a margin of error in our method, but if 55% of those vetted mergers prices go up, this is as good or as bad as tossing a coin. And I would say tossing a coin is not a very scientific method. It's certainly much cheaper than doing economic analysis. So this is, and what's been it is a decision tool, by the way, tossing a coin. I said yes, no. Okay. But that's the same result. What's been the response? The response has never been to engage deeply with our methods. On the contrary, it's been cherry-picking the few studies that showed something nice, and then simply saying, looking at defects, at the negative of the existing studies, pointing to you don't have the right data. With our data, we can show something different. So, but the profession did not want to engage with that. So our methods don't work. By the way, this reminds me of a quote that Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, said 2 weeks ago in Davos. She was talking in a different context. She was talking about the macroeconomists, and she said, basically, economists are a tribal clique. They only speak to themselves. They are not interested in the rest of the world. Perhaps models have something to do with it. So I think it's an important criticism that we have to consider. The second and last point that I want to make is my second claim is that the profession has become fairly insular. Christina already mentioned the attempts we made from the inside to bring us, other colleagues, to bring topics to the competition policy arena, such as increased concentration, increasing margin, labor market consideration, killer acquisition, platforms, so you name it. A lot of stuff has been debated, but the response was always, it's not for us and nothing to be. But I want to do on something bigger, which is the topic of our panel, prices and power. So take this example. Take a merger or a monopolization case happening in a very small island in the Outer Hebrides or in the amazing Aegean Sea, Greek side or Turkish side. Amazing place. There is a monopolization case. We would apply certain economics. Then take the same kind of merger or monopolization case happening with involving a company which has hundreds of millions of customers, maybe billions. Visa, Microsoft, Google. If you ask a normal intelligent person in the street, shall we use the same economic analysis for these two different situations? They would say, but you're mad. Okay. Why? Because the second situation has got power. What do you mean by power? But power has many dimensions, but they are so obvious. The power to have resources, the power to affect via lobbying, advocacy, the authorities, revolving doors, the power to affect the public because you have access to the media, you can establish narratives. They are totally different situations. Why would you use the same economics? What we do, and I'm not actually making a caricature, we apply exactly the same economics. The same. There is no difference between, of course, you may say there is the enforcers may decide on priorities which are different. The second cases for some enforcers, not for everybody, are to be given a greater priority, but this is not because of the contribution of economists, because of maybe a political decision, etc. So the relevant question for us is, do we have anything to say about power? And if we don't, because in current tools we don't, why should people listen to us? Because these are completely different objects to me, also from an economic point of view. So I will conclude by going back to the quote of Christine Lagarde. She was speaking on a panel that was called How to Trust Economics. That was her panel. And I think this is a relevant question for all of us. So first of all, have we lost trust in economics? And I think we have. And how to get that trust back is the next question. But perhaps I will give you my views on that in the next round. Thank you.
Next segment. I'm going to move directly to Andreas because I know I saw you nodding when Luigi was talking about the purpose of antitrust being ultimately freedom, being something that gives us the choice that we deserve rather than some abstract notion of consumer welfare, which is the one that has prevailed. But give us your views on this debate. How do you think, in Germany more broadly, you are of course also president of ICN, this shift is affecting how you want to see antitrust enforced? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christina, thanks for having me. I was really sorry I was late last night. I missed the speakers' dinner. And I could say I was a victim of the farmers who blocked Brussels last night. I couldn't get in. But I could also turn it another way. I could say I was victim of European regulation. Because of that, farmers blocked Brussels last night and I couldn't get here. Well, Christina, of course, it is most interesting to listen to all these economists and how much they struggle with the fact that they have taken over, that they have won, that they had one victory after the other, and now they have no idea what to do with that. And I could be very short here. On this panel and say, well, look at Bonn. The Bundeskartellamt, German antitrust, was never about the price. It was always about power. at least to a certain extent. And I will explain a little bit why this is so. And I also want to draw a bigger picture, because if I get it right, we talk about here on this panel about the next economic world order. And I just wanted to give you a smell where I believe in which environment, in which new environment we work as competition agencies. Well, we see an enormous shift around the world. We see a shift of economic growth and wealth, most of all with regard to China. We see all these wars in Israel, in Ukraine. And I personally believe this is not something that is far apart. It affects our work. It has an impact on our work. Why is this so? Because all this leads to regulation, also due to the fact that we live in such a highly consolidated and concentrated world as we live today with regard to economics. And it becomes very clear that competition and the enforcement of competition law is no longer the only kid on the block. There are new kids on the block that want to play with economics. One kid is foreign subsidies regulation. We talked about that already this morning. We see heavily foreign subsidies. First of all, we see European subsidies. If you look at the Green Deal, if you look at ICPI, if you look at the transition into sustainability, all this does not work with subsidies. But we also see foreign subsidies. If you look at the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, lots of subsidies. The consequence is there are heavy proceedings in Europe about the assessment of foreign subsidies. So that is new, that is regulation in a way. Second point, foreign direct investment. Also here, lengthy proceedings, vast regulation, which is not completely new, that has always been there, but it has a new impact and it has new consequences for the economy. The third point that we have to tackle is sustainability. I mentioned that already. Sustainability in Europe leads to heavy regulation. If you look at, for example, Section 210A of the Common Market Order, which is about sustainability, leaving aside the consumer, just putting in place a pure and naked exemption from competition in the area of agricultural products. Pure exemption from competition. The consumer does not play a role anymore. The price does not play a role anymore. It is just about sustainability. We will still see what this is going to be about. Fourthly, I must mention it here, the digital economy. We've seen the DMA, which is a good thing. I think with the DMA, for the first time, we might see something is moving in the digital economy. Because in the past, we have had fantastic cases, very sophisticated cases, but have we been able, as competition agencies, to make markets contestable? I doubt that. We have had great cases to make markets fairer. If you look at the Amazon case that we have done in Bonn in 2019, since when Amazon is liable towards the merchants, since when Amazon has to give a deadline for dismissing a merchant, it has to give a reason when dismissing a merchant. There's jurisdiction in Germany if a merchant sues Amazon. This is all fine. This has made this world much fairer, but has it made it more contestable? I doubt that. I doubt that very, very much. Now, as I said, with the DMA, for the first time ever, we have a smell, we get a feeling that competitors for the first time seem to believe that things are really improving to a certain extent. And now we have to cope with AI, artificial intelligence. Who's going to benefit from AI? It's going to be big tech, the usual suspects. They have the data, they have the computational skills, they have the they have the financial resources. I think we're lagging behind here again in Europe. We're very happy if a new startup like Aleph Alpha is getting 500 million euros from a financing round. In the US, ChatGPT, OpenAI gets $4 billion from Microsoft, just one single company. So again, we're lagging behind, which doesn't make it easy as well for competition. And then there are the legal standards in Germany, in Europe, when you want to enforce competition law. I think the best example is the Meta case. I'm not going into the details here. But if you look at the court proceedings here, you wonder, is that really the way forward to enforce competition? We won in the Higher Regional Court in a preliminary proceeding. And we went to Karlsruhe, Federal Supreme Court. We lost. Back to the Higher Regional Court in Düsseldorf. We lost again. Back to Karlsruhe. We won, we didn't win. The case was withdrawn because the Federal Supreme Court had given signals that we would win. Then we went back to the Higher Regional Court in Düsseldorf. What happened there? The case was referred to the European Court of Justice to Luxembourg, and now it is going back to Düsseldorf after the European Court of Justice has answered the questions by the Higher Regional Court after 5 years. That court proceeding has started in 2019. Now we are in 2024. It has taken 5 years to get a reset and to get a start. I just described that because this is the environment in which, for the time being, we try to enforce competition law. Mark, I'm not saying anything against the courts. I mean, there have been 3 courts that have been dealing with that. But we must really wonder, in this fast-moving world, is this the way forward? And if I look at all this regulation that we have seen in Brussels, do we really need a Digital Services Act by which we regulate smaller platforms? Do we need that? If I look at the AI Act, we must wonder, what is the AI Act in the very end doing to competition in this area? Do we really need that? What does it do to the startup scene in Europe? So, given all this regulation, given the very slow proceedings that we see before court, you can really wonder, what is the role of competition in the future, and how do we enforce it successfully in this heavily regulated world with these slow proceedings? And here, I must say, everything that I've described, it is not about price. The digital economy is not about price anyway, to a certain extent. There's an artificial price to a certain extent, which is data. But there's not a real price, and we still, as my belief, still haven't found the real clue how to deal with that question, how to deal with data as a currency. We haven't still found the proper clue yet, although, again, we have seen fantastic cases here. So if I look at all this in a nutshell, I think above all what we need to do as competition agencies and what we need to do in competition law, we need to keep our compass. We have to be aware that we can regulate everything, but nothing can do for mankind what competition can do for mankind. So of course we have to regulate to a certain extent, but at the same time we have to take care that we still create this environment of freedom for entrepreneurship in Europe, to make sure that we do not only regulate, but we also act and we invent. Sometimes I have the impression the US are going to invent with AI and everything, and we invent regulation here in Europe. That is not the way forward if we want to keep our wealth, if we really want to do something for consumer welfare. And this takes me again back, to be frank, to very traditional ordoliberal thinking. Because ordoliberal thinking has put the accent on freedom. And this is what we need to a certain extent reinstall here in Europe, this freedom to compete. And we should never forget that competition on the merits is also about equal chance and is also about democracy in the economy. And that is very important for today. So competition is the value to create all these things, and this is what we should have in mind. So I think we should not discuss this very narrow issue of price and power. We should talk about power, because for the first time since decades with big tech, we see companies that don't only have an economic power, they also have a political power. And every little step we want to do, every little bit of competition we want to enforce, we really have to enforce. Step by step, tiny step, proceeding before court after proceeding before court. Let's not forget about that. So my advice is very strict and rigorous enforcement of competition in this world.
It's always refreshing to hear Andreas, I have to say. One, he is a pioneer, and I've said it many times, in terms of pursuing the Facebook case and really acknowledging the role of data in power. This is was a pioneering case which I think has excited many of us and deserves the attention it deserves. But also, I think you're being candid and frank in saying, we do regulation, that's great. It does perhaps bring about a little bit more fairness between players. Whether it will induce contestability is a big question. We say it will, but what is our theory of change when it comes to ultimately the power that needs to be dispersed? This is the question that faces us. And how do we use competition and antitrust in a way that is effective there? Doesn't die of death in 10 years of appeals. That is a problem. Let me move on to Rebecca, who, of course, again, Commissioner at the FTC, has been really involved in what is a big change, a big evolution in the agency over the last few years. The FTC is now absolutely at the forefront of being a very progressive agency with big goals, big perspectives, and a lot of work already under your belt. So why don't you give us a perspective?
Thank you, Christina. It's such a pleasure to be here. The worst part about an interesting and exciting conference like this with so many provocative speakers is there are too many things to say and not enough time to say it. And so I'm going to try to be a little bit succinct and make just a few points. The first is I want to fully associate myself with your point and Luigi's point that antitrust, there is no apolitical, neutral application of the law, as aspirational as that goal may seem. Non-intervention is a policy choice. Intervention is a policy choice. They are both policy choices. And I also share the view that economics doesn't necessarily provide us with some neutral, independent analysis. The way I know this is if you look at any litigated antitrust case, merger, conduct, in the litigation, you're going to have at least two economic experts arguing from the same set of data exact opposite conclusions. You cannot have a neutral, independent science that necessarily arrives at two completely opposite conclusions and think that it provides you some independent analysis. So I think economic analysis can be a valuable tool, but it is just one tool that we have to think about how we approach different cases. It's part of why at the FTC we're really working on building out our technical expertise beyond economics. We stood up the Office of Technology. We are building out data science and other types of analytical expertise so that we can understand what's going on in markets, not just from the view of economists, but also thinking about how these businesses are making the decisions that they're making. The second point that I want to make is it is incumbent on us as enforcers to learn from the past and how we have been doing things, rather than just continue on a course because we had set that course 40 years ago or whenever. I think Tommaso's point about retrospectives is really important in mergers. If we are looking back and not growing and improving our analysis from past mistakes, we are doing a disservice to the laws that we are enforcing. One really important area here, I think, is understanding the intersection of the tools that we have. Speaking for the FTC, we do competition, we also do consumer protection. We are charged with protecting against unfair and deceptive acts and practices, unfair methods of competition. Historically, these things have been treated as entirely separate modes of analysis, but that's not true. Consumer protection enforcement is about creating and maintaining competitive, honest markets where businesses can get ahead by providing the best services, at the best prices, and innovating and being honest about it and treating their customers fairly. That's a very pro-competitive endeavor. And then the final big picture point I want to make is to respectfully disagree with a point I heard Olivier make earlier today, which is that competition is a side dish. I don't agree with that. I think competition underlies and is implicated by all the work of government. And we're either going to do that with open eyes, thinking about the competition effects of different government policies and choices, or we're going to do that with our eyes closed. But either way, we're going to affect competition. President Biden, early in his term, one of his first big actions was to announce a whole of government approach to competition policy. I think this is really important for the conversation about regulation, because regulation done well can be very pro-competitive. One small example in the US is telecom regulation that requires buildings to be open to multiple broadband competitors. That's not an antitrust enforcement action, but it is a very pro-competitive regulation. So I think having mindfulness about the competition implications of all of the work we do is important. For all the reasons Andreas talked about, ex post enforcement is hard. Once markets have consolidated, cases take a long time. Getting corrective action is really, really challenging. So what we need to do is be thinking in a future-looking way about how markets can be built competitively to begin with, rather than just taking corrective action once a problem has condensed. And so that is why you're going to hear, and you do hear from competition agencies, a lot of conversation about AI right now. I think we have huge mindfulness about the lessons learned from the hands-off approach to the social media era, and not wanting to repeat that. There are real questions about whether we have already missed a moment, given the dominance of large incumbents in the critical inputs for AI, whether it's chips or compute. But I think we are not willing to take a step back and say, this has already happened, so we need to let it go. I think we're saying, how can we make sure we understand these things and move forward? It's why, again, we're trying to use all the different statutory tools that Congress gave us to move forward, not just ex post enforcement cases or merger challenges, but also, for example, last week we launched a 6B study into the kinds of partnerships that Andreas talked about in AI to understand investments that are not necessarily cast as acquisitions, but may have really important competitive effects on the market. So.
Thank you so much. Before going round again, I would like to bring Gina on into the panel. Thank you for waiting patiently, Gina. You are on the other side of the world, and it is great to have you. I just wanted to ask you, you're of course involved in considering what the implications of these big shifts are for your regime. One of the areas that I know you are engaged in very actively is bringing merger control in Australia into into an area which is possibly more effective. I know that there is a big discussion in Australia about whether what you're trying to do is actually going to undermine growth, undermine business, and yet this is the kind of the important development that needs to happen in order to come into line with the way in which we think about mergers now, as you heard even on this panel. Why don't you give us a sense for what you are dealing with in Australia and you're thinking, where do you think this is going?
Good morning, Christina. It's good to be with you, and I hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah, fine.
Good. The ACCC has been advocating for change to our merger regime for over 2 years. Everyone, I believe, in this conference will agree that a strong and effective merger regime is in the public interest. It's an essential ingredient in the creation, fostering of competitive, dynamic and resilient markets, and the ACCC is pursuing this very prominently as a policy question. Consideration about whether and how to modernise Australia's merger control regime, we consider, raises fundamental questions about the risk tolerance for allowing anti-competitive mergers to proceed against blocking mergers that do little or no competitive harm, and where the harms from these risks should lie. We consider it's appropriate to place the risk and costs of uncertainty about the future with the merger parties rather than with the economy, all participants across the economy, and consumers and innovation. And for this to happen, we need a policy and law shift. Interestingly, currently our government has tasked a merger reform task force to look at these questions. And last night, our Minister Lee, Minister for Competition, said competition is crucial if Australia is to make the most of the big shifts around digitalisation, growth in the care economy and the net zero transformation, because we have worrying signs in our economy that the intensity of competition has weakened over recent decades with increased market concentration and markups. And he has asked the question, are our laws, and starting with our merger laws, fit for purpose? The ACCC says no, they're no longer fit for purpose. It is fascinating. Part of one of the things that Competition Task Force has done is use microdata held by our Australian Bureau of Statistics on labour flows between Australian businesses, adopting a US methodology to assess this. And that data has confirmed that with the current voluntary, non-suspensory, non-mandatory, enforcement-based regime that we have in Australia, that the ACCC only has partial visibility of merger and acquisition activity. So the task force database has shown that between 1,000 to 1,500 mergers have taken place in the last 14 years. The ACCC only has notified to it around 330 each year. In addition, really tellingly, the data also shows the acquisitions are disproportionately made by already very large firms. The largest 1% of firms have made around a half of all the acquisitions. So these have been increasingly concentrating to our markets, and we would say also accumulating, including through serial acquisitions, market power, a large number of transactions, many of which, the majority of which we are not seeing. So what do we have? We have a current voluntary enforcement-based regime relying on the willing compliance of merger parties and their advisors. And the ACCC has seen that this has voluntary cooperation has diminished significantly in recent years. We're either not notified, notified late, or provided insufficient information, and with strategic behaviour that pushes us not to have sufficient time to investigate to be able to take enforcement action to prevent completion. Similarly, and particularly in large global transactions, because we are one of the few jurisdictions without mandatory suspensory regime, we are given a very low priority in terms of engagement with the ACCC. We hear from overseas regulators, or we hear, in fact, from customers that the transaction is likely to proceed. It means also that we have no upfront information requirement and parties can consummate the merger before we have finalised our review. We are not only concerned about the process, we're concerned about the test and the policy. Increasingly, the ACCC considers the enforcement-based model skews decision-making towards a default of allowing mergers to proceed. In relation to these mergers, we consider that our proposed reforms will make the most difference. We must establish currently in court, similarly to the US, that the merger is likely to have the effect of substantially lessening competition, though in the US it's may substantially lessen competition, but the future is inherently uncertain and more so than it has ever been. And this uncertainty can be the driving factor behind the difficulties of positively proving a breach, which is why we're proposing that it's merger parties who must demonstrate to us that the transaction is not likely to result in an SLC before they can proceed. So you are right, Christina, there have been many claims that our proposals, though they are in line with many jurisdictions in the world, that our proposals are overly burdensome, impose costs, and will stifle investment. There are arguments that there should be no reform, that what we have is working well. Interestingly, when we see less than a quarter of the transactions that are actually occurring, so they're not even on our radar, most mergers raise no problems, and that we can change our merger guidelines. Contrary to these suggestions, we say for a number of reasons the issues cannot simply be addressed by updating our guidelines and processes. Why is this? Because the same incentives will apply if it remains to be voluntary. That happen currently in a voluntary enforcement-based regime, the merger parties and their advisors are unlikely to have an incentive to change behaviour just if it remains voluntary. We also say the fact that the vast majority of mergers raise little or no competition concerns is not an argument for having no reform. Our proposal includes a fast-track approval process for the many transactions which we understand will continue to show no likely competition concern. But for those transactions where there is a real risk, a real threat to maintaining competition in a country where many of our markets are already quite concentrated, we need a policy change. We need to shift the risk and costs of uncertainty about the future to the merger parties rather than to our economy.
Thank you, and I really wanted Gina to be on this platform because I want to underline what she's engaged with in Australia is pretty heroic fight to bring merger control into line with the urgency with which we need to address issues like market concentration, market power, and the kind of pushback she's facing from the defense business complex is predictable, but I think really ahistoric. The world is moving in that direction. So I think it's not just a conversation between, certainly not Europe and the US. There are other jurisdictions that are facing with the very same issues and very much commend Gina for pushing this type of reform, which is important in Australia. Let me just go back to the group for a final few minutes of comments. I don't want to particularly put a question, but a number of the points that have come out, I think, are points that the audience ought to keep or retain. So Becca talked about the sense of urgency with which we need to address some of this, including in AI. We'll talk about AI later. I wanted to underline further the initiative of the FTC. I know that Andreas, as a regulator, is preoccupied with how market power in AI may be already entrenched and what can we do about it. More generally, the message that comes out from this group is, it's not sort of step-by-step or gradual. There are forces that compel us to really be much more aggressive and active. We are doing things today we wouldn't have been doing three years ago. And so what are the final thoughts you all have around this? Can I start with you, Luigi, perhaps?
I think that the challenge posed by AI is huge. And as Andreas said, I think that we need to think about how to promote competition, not only how to enforce antitrust ex post. Now, it's easier said than done how to do it, but I think that we need to think fast and try to find a solution fast, because this problem is incumbent upon us and will stay for a long, long time. So I think that this is where the tall order is to come up with something soon.
Andreas, any further thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we look a lot at AI, and sometimes I'm very much afraid that it is true what Alex Karp, the co-founder and CEO of Palantir, has said frequently. We are already at a point that you have no idea of. And this is my fear, that this has already developed into something that we don't see as competition agencies. And this is the key point for me, Christina. The key point is we have really to be vigorous with regard to merger control. This is why I'm really happy that we seem to see a shift of strictness with regard to merger control in order to make sure that we do not have to deal with all this mess afterwards in lengthy abuse proceedings, which are so hard to win. And maybe one last point on this. Abuse proceedings in former times were very seldom. They were a niche part of our work. Today, they are the focus of our work to a certain extent. We have had conferences here at your place in this hotel. Not your place, but in this hotel, which were solely about abuse cases in the digital sector, and this is key. And here we are by far too slow. That is key. Not only us, but also the courts. And I have no idea how to deal with that, because again, I'm not blaming the courts for everything. We have a system. And we have constitutions and everything. But we cannot deal with this industry with the perspective that a case lasts at least 8, 9, 10 years. And when we have finished that, the problem is long gone. Long gone. And
Isn't that going to be an issue?
And we have problems that we don't even see in the future. So I think that is key. And I don't have a clue for that. But strict merger control is a key for that. Maybe the DMA will do some change, although I'm very much afraid we will see a lot of litigation also with the DMA. Can take some time. So again, merger control is part of the solution to me. But of course, we need additional tools, and we should not shy away from anything.
Tommaso, what is the answer to the pretty bleak description you've given of the role of, or the way in which economics is being used now? What would you like to see?
So I want to say something different. But
say what you like.
No, I will respond to that too. But AI, since it's interesting, this was the topic of our conversation with Luigi last night, and this is a very broad picture, but sometimes broad pictures are important to start with. And I see the value chain there, the supply chain. You need some hardware, that's basically NVIDIA, that's a monopolist, period. Then you need the cloud, that's 3 firms, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And then you need really large data sets to train, and that's basically, again, Microsoft, Google, and a handful. So there are specific applications where you will have entry, you will have fantastic things, and we will hear the narrative about those, of course, but I think we are already late, so doom and gloom. A comment to what Rebecca said, just to clarify the role of economics and the difference between the US and Europe, we are not in an adversarial system in Europe. So when you hear about the economic arguments, you hear the economic analysis done by the enforcers themselves. For instance, at DG Comp, we could not have recourse to any help from the outside. And then the consult. So there is an inherent asymmetry. It's not just, I can say this and the opposite, but also the asymmetry of resources and the quality of the evidence that can be brought in front of judges changes because of the asymmetry of resources and incentives. And finally, the kind of economics. So we try to give wake-up calls to the profession many times in this room and elsewhere. And frankly, I think that by now people are very much awakened. So it's not about listening to what I have to say. Again, I've suffered a few scars. The reaction was not very good. But who cares between the spat between me and the profession? That's irrelevant. What's more interesting is that In a day like today, I see at least half of the faces in the audience that I don't know, which is great. And half of the faces in the audience which coincide with those I don't know are really young, which is promising. So there is clearly an interest in these issues coming from wider society. I haven't checked the participants list, I will, but I think it's coming from not the usual suspects. Rebecca didn't mention, but when you discuss in the US the new merger guidelines, you receive unprecedented number of comments. So the 2010 merger guidelines received maybe a couple of dozen comments from the usual suspects. This time it was 2,000. Again, there is a desire in society to know more, to be present in a different way. And this is democracy. This is great. And this is the right direction. So in my opinion, the important thing and the outcome of a context like this is to convey this interest and energy in the right way.
Becca, last word to you, and then we'll conclude.
Sure. I think I wanted to take the point that Andreas made about how it's very hard to do these ex post interventions and expand on it a little bit by saying that is why we are extremely focused on deterrence in our work going forward. So an individual case may take a long time, but it also sends an important market-wide message about where our concerns are. And I want to just take a moment to rattle off some of our recent accomplishments that I really hope will have effective deterrence in the markets. So we won a preliminary injunction challenging healthcare data advertising market merger. That's a really involving a company called IQVIA. It's a market you've probably never heard of, but is extremely important and is right at the intersection of data, power, advertising, and competition. We successfully challenged a hospital merger in Northern California that abandoned. We won a motion to dismiss in our conduct case against a bunch of pesticides manufacturers that has huge implications. We successfully challenged multiple pharma mergers in the last couple of years. When I first got to the FTC and said, maybe we should outright challenge some pharma mergers, people looked at me like I had 15 heads. And we have done that effectively. Similarly, we had a really huge victory out of the extremely conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in our Illumina case at the end of last year. That's another one where when I first got to the FTC and I said, maybe we should outright challenge some vertical mergers, everybody said, no, that's not what we do. We impose behavioral remedies. And that we have very much changed tact on that with bipartisan support at each stage of that particular case, and a decision that came from a bipartisan panel. I think that's really important to emphasize. Of course, earlier this week, we saw the announcement that Amazon and iRobot had abandoned. The companies publicly disclosed over a year ago that the FTC was investigating that transaction. Because no complaint had been filed at the time of abandonment, there is not a lot that is available in the public to talk about the substance of the company's investigation. But I think it is worthwhile to note that that is the first time Amazon has had a successful challenge to an acquisition. That's a big change in direction. And then just on the consumer protection side, a few things that I think are important from a competition perspective. We effectively challenged Rite Aid's use of facial recognition technology. We proposed a new auto rule to make the process of buying a car fairer and more transparent to people. We've brought a bunch of really important cases challenging data brokers' use of sensitive data. Again, important competition implications. We've proposed new child privacy rules, and we have ongoing rulemakings involving junk fees and click to cancel, and of course, data security and commercial surveillance. It's a lot of hard work. Our staff is unbelievable in the amount of things that they can produce, and all of it, I hope, will help move markets, not just in the individual cases, but sending messages across the board that we want to see more competitive, healthy markets.
I think, if anything, what comes out of this panel is a sense of great acceleration and emphasis, and the need for more rather than less, the need for merger control to be more muscular rather than less. So let me just thank the panelists, because we have run out of time. We mentioned a few times the judges and the courts. We will hear from them next. Join me in thanking the speakers for this great discussion. If I could have Mark and Marcus, please, joining us.